Well, hello to all, wherever you may be watching. Thank you for joining me for this discussion. My name is Michael Kugelman. I'm the Asia Program Deputy Director and Senior Associate for South Asia at the Wilson Center. Today, we will be discussing the future of the U.S.-Pakistan relationship. As many of you will know, this is a relationship that has experienced its share of highs and lows over time. There is a fair degree of cooperation during the Cold War era, but then a rather lean period during the 1990s. A period of cooperation reemerged after the 9/11 attacks, but tensions were never far from the surface, and the relationship fell into a deep crisis for a long period beginning in 2011, and only began to stabilize several years ago when the Trump administration asked Islamabad to assist Washington in its efforts to launch bilateral negotiations with the Taliban in Afghanistan. Today, the relationship is crisis-free, relatively speaking, but its future, with the Biden administration having now taken power, is uncertain and unsettled. For 4 decades, the U.S. has tended to view its relationship with Islamabad through the lens of Afghanistan. But with the U.S. drawing down in Afghanistan, there will be a need for a new basis to anchor the relationship. So we're looking at a relationship that's approaching an inflection point. Today, we will get a perspective from Islamabad about the U.S.-Pakistan relationship and how Pakistan views this complicated relationship moving forward. And we are delighted today to be featuring Dr. Moeed Yusuf, who is the National Security Advisor to Prime Minister Imran Khan. His full title is Assistant to the Prime Minister on National Security and Strategic Policy Planning. Anyone who has studied Pakistan or South Asia, especially in Washington over the last decade or so, must surely know Moeed or know of him. He was a DC think tanker for a number of years. He spent time at the U.S. Institute of Peace, where he was Director of South Asia Programs and later Associate Vice President at the Asia Center at USIP. He's published research on a range of security issues in South Asia. And in 2018, I believe, he published a book on U.S. crisis management in South Asia. He's also been a fellow at the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University, where he earned his PhD, and he was also a research fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School. This is a very impressive background that he has, but what I think is perhaps most impressive about Moeed is that until relatively recently, when he joined the Pakistani government, he stayed off social media and he did not have a Twitter account. And I'm sure that made him a lot more productive and a lot less stressed than the rest of us. So Moeed will offer some opening remarks, and then I'll pose a few questions and take questions from our audience. If you in the audience would like to pose a question to Moeed, please either email it to asia@wilsoncenter.org, CENTER, or tweet your question to @AsiaProgram, PROGRAM. I'll try to pose as many of your questions as I can. So with that, no one came here to hear me speak. Everyone wants to hear from Dr. Yusuf. So I now give the floor to our guest speaker. Over to you, Moeed.
Michael, thanks. First of all, thank you for hosting me, and thanks to the Woodrow Wilson Center. I also want to recognize the Islamabad Policy Research Institute, who've also been part of making this happen and making sure that this gets on my schedule. And for once, I honor it. These days, I can't control my life at all. So wonderful to be here, wonderful to see you, and I'm sure there are many other old friends and colleagues online as well. The good news, Michael, of the bad news that I'm on social media is that I still don't manage my account. So don't think that what I'm writing is taking my time away from what I have to do. All right, to business. Look, I want to put out where Pakistan is in terms of engaging the new US administration. And I want to have a very different conversation than perhaps your opening presented, and it was actually an accurate depiction of what Pakistan and US have been talking about. And that's exactly the message I want your audience to take away. I think if I were to start by saying the fundamental goal that I think this relationship should have and both sides should work towards is for once having a truly bilateral relationship which doesn't look at the other side from lens A, lens B, or lens C. It should be a Pakistan-US relationship, has to be candid, has to be honest and realistic on what we can achieve. I think that's where I would like to go. And frankly, both sides have faltered in this in the past. We worked very, very closely. You mentioned the Cold War, you mentioned post 9/11, major non-NATO ally, all of that. And yet, let's accept that there were hiccups and there was mistrust and there were conversations when you and I used to sit and pontificate in Washington for years. Pakistan, there was a narrative about security dominated state, civil military, the word do more, the word double game, the word India centric. And in Pakistan, a conversation about US policies in Afghanistan being the real problem, having caused a great harm and disarray in Pakistan in terms of terrorism, US propping up India, US, and fundamentally where I think there was an agreement even in Washington at the time, that Pakistan was unfortunately seen through the Afghan prism. And I think that's where many of the conversations went sour and things became more difficult. Now, I think we have a real opportunity for a fresh start. Now, the word reset has been used and overused, and fresh start has been used and overused, but I really mean it when I say this, and I'm going to unpack for you why I think so, and then what may be areas where we can move forward. First of all, let me just say that the biggest mistake that can be made at this point by both sides, but the incoming administration as it looks at Pakistan, is to start from where many of the colleagues who are now going to be in administration left in 2016. Because if that's the lens that's going to be applied to the relationship, I'm afraid we're going to have the same old conversation and the same old problems. But there are two major differences, which I think I want to inform your audience about, that simply make it illogical for both sides to start from where they left. Number one, we are talking about this in a completely different world than we had in 2016. Great power competition is at a very different place and plane. The US-China relationship, which is going to dominate global conversations and affect many countries and relationships, but Pakistan surely so, given Pakistan's relationship with China, its geography, and its relationship with the US. Second, the real conversation, or most of the conversation at the time about Afghanistan. Afghanistan remains just as important, but is at a very different place now. The real sort of conversation at that time was, how do we get to a peace process? How do we get to a dialogue that's Afghan-led, Afghan-owned? How do we get people, the Taliban, Afghan faction, and the US in the same room? That's done now. And the previous US administration has acknowledged Pakistan's role and the fact that it would not have happened without Pakistan. This is now common perception, public knowledge. So we are now at a point where we've crossed the milestone that was the problem at the time. We have clear milestones. There's an agreement, not with Pakistan, but between the actors who ultimately have to decide Afghanistan's fate and destiny. So to my mind, there is an opportunity for a far more constructive conversation, even though there are many roadblocks that may come ahead, on how do we reach the finish line. From Pakistan's perspective, I think we are at a point where we really can get there if people keep investing in it. And whatever is decided by the Afghan faction sitting in the room is acceptable to Pakistan. This is a different place than we left Afghanistan at in 2016. Third, obviously, naturally, a constant topic of conversation in the past, present, and future is India. I don't need to inform this audience why. Today, we are dealing with a very different India than it was in 2016 and definitely in 2012 and 2010 and whatever. You're dealing with an India that is moving from intolerance to major sort of discrimination within. You're moving to a point where there is serious internal tensions, human rights concerns. You are dealing with an India that has vocally and publicly talked about unilateral decisions to resolve problems, including in the illegally occupied territory of Kashmir. You are dealing with an India that essentially has a conflict or a spat with every single neighbor in the region. And I don't need to sort of elaborate on this. Bottom line is, if the US has been talking about India as a counterweight to China, if the US has been talking about India as a strategic partner where natural values align, then I'm afraid that's not the country you're dealing with anymore. And allow me to say that this relationship is becoming a liability for virtually everybody who's working with India at the time. So I don't think one can just shy away from the fact and keep calling India India without realizing what's happening in India, how India is destabilizing the region. You have seen a full-fledged Pakistani dossier that's been put out on Indian terrorism. Don't believe that. We've asked the US and other countries and intelligence agencies to do a forensic analysis and look for themselves and decide. You've seen the EU Disinfo Lab sort of report, which shows a 15-year plus long global disinformation campaign against Pakistan. And most recently, you've seen one of their major anchors and the leaks of his or making public of his WhatsApp chats, which show the link between domestic politics, the drive to win elections, and the strikes in Balakot in a nuclear region, I may remind you. So you're talking of a completely different country where different conversations have to happen. Terrorism was the fourth big issue. The situation of terrorism in Pakistan, I don't need to tell anybody, is incomparable to what it was in the past. We've turned the corner. We've actually learned lessons that can be shared with the world, but simply not the behemoth that it was. And finally, if you allow me, the US is a very different country. And again, I think enough said on that. We've just gone through a period of a few months that reflects that. And so the domestic agenda, of course, is going to be heavy on the new administration's mind. And that's a very different place than 2016. So the point I'm making is business as usual, if it was what it was in the previous time, is simply illogical now, given how different the situation is and the key issues on which the two sides worked on are. The second big difference, one is the world. The second big difference, and this is perhaps even more important, is that you are dealing with a very different Pakistan. A Pakistan whose formal vision now, as approved and instructed by the Prime Minister, my boss, Pakistan is squarely in an economic security paradigm now. Pakistan is talking about a geo-economic location, not a geostrategic location, even though, of course, we have that geostrategic edge. We are talking of ourselves as a geo-economic melting pot that is ready to consolidate global positive economic interests in our territory. We are talking of providing the world with economic bases, not military bases. It's a totally different conversation. Now, of course, one can have this argument on, show me, where on the ground this has happened. I'll show you 10 things and you'll point out to the 11th and say, well, actually, look, it hasn't happened. Yeah, absolutely. This is the vision. This is where we're going. It's not 100% there, but it's a very different approach than in the past. What does this economic security paradigm entail? Number one, connectivity. Big focus on connectivity. CPEC is, of course, an obvious example of this. Why do we want peace in Afghanistan? One major reason is connecting to Central Asia. We are even ready for eastward connectivity. Unfortunately, that option and that flank is completely closed because of India's outlook, behavior, and demeanor. And I've spoken to that, so I don't need to sort of repeat it. The second pillar is development partnerships, not assistance. We are not, Pakistan, of course, will require assistance from the world for the foreseeable future, but we are not here to talk about assistance. The first thing we want to talk about is investment partnerships. There's conversation about CPEC, not always positive in Washington. How about an American reprocessing zone? How about American companies coming, investing money, reprocessing for export and sending wherever they want? How about doing things economically where there can be Pakistan, US, China co-investment? How about extending connectivity that has come into Pakistan via the north-south route to Afghanistan for Afghanistan's benefit? So what are those economic partnership models that we can benefit from? And the third element is a state that is responsible to its citizens and responsible beyond its borders, i.e. regional peace, global peace, wherever we can go. We talk about the Middle East now. We've chosen the difficult path of offering a friendly relationship to every Muslim country, helping where we can. We've talked about peace in terms of the region. And even within dealing with the challenges, we need a much better economic environment and performance. We recognize that. There have been other questions raised, in terms of the domestic space in Pakistan. All of that we are working on day in, day out. Are we 100% there? No. But that's the focus, that's the vision. So to talk to this country, this Pakistan, about only terrorism and only do more and only Afghanistan, I think you'll just completely miss Pakistan of today if that would be the US approach. So let me towards the end put some sort of meat on the bones. Could we look at areas of diplomatic cooperation? Afghanistan is an obvious one, right? I mean, that we know that. But it'll be tragic if the conversation next week begins on Afghanistan and that's the only conversation we're having. US, China, a lot of people say, well, Pakistan is in one camp or the other. Let me just tell you very clearly, we are simply not into camp politics. Not because, of this reason or that reason, it simply doesn't suit us. It doesn't make sense for us to say I'm with one and not the other. Neither, frankly, have the Chinese ever asked us that, or the US for that matter, because ultimately, frankly, I think Pakistan is one of the very few countries that can play a helping role for the US and China on areas where they do converge and want to work together. Our territory can be used for the confluence of interests. Climate change is a shared agenda. Global norms and multilateralism is a shared agenda. Pakistan has done this in the past, and we can see where that can happen again. Why can't we all co-invest in Pakistan and Afghanistan? That's the approach we should be thinking of. Also, Middle East. There definitely can be conversations on how Pakistan can play a helping role. Then a big basket that I hope we focus on, as I said, development partnerships. Reconstruction opportunity zones was brought up during the Obama administration. Can we look at that? Can we go back to concessional export reprocessing in Pakistan for Afghanistan? Can we look at industrial cooperation and, as I said, maybe reprocessing zone for US companies? Rather than talking about, big picture, we want better economic relationship, this and that, let's pick priority sectors. IT, big opportunity. Pakistan is one of the largest number of freelancers in the world, lowest cost IT production, great human capital. Can we work on that? Energy, Pakistan is energy deficient. US is now for the first time a net exporter, shale technology, etc. Agriculture, we've talked about this for years, haven't really developed it. IDFC's infrastructure development. There are multiple areas here where we can work on specifics. Global issues, climate change. Prime Minister Imran Khan is probably the most active in the global south. The World Economic Forum has recognized Pakistan's work, etc. We know how serious the Biden administration is. Where is the overlap where we can partner even formally on that? Pakistan's success against COVID has been recognized by the world. Can we do global lessons learned? Let's even start with a conference on global lessons and how to deal with the next pandemic. Even challenging issues. I'm one not to shy away. I mean, I know human rights is big on the agenda. Let's talk about it, and we'll show you what our trajectory is, where we are going, what we've done, where we are lacking, and trying. And we expect the same kind of candor from the US in terms of its own challenges and weaknesses. And then you've got a whole host of issues where we don't see eye to eye completely. Pakistan, India. Well, India is huge for us. India is an existential problem for us. So don't expect us not to talk about it. But there's also no point just drawing bad blood, on an issue where there's not 100% convergence. So let's sit down and figure out only one issue. How do we get to regional peace in a way that international law obligations are met by both sides and we don't get into crises every day? Let's start from that. Security assistance, I told you we are in for partnerships now, not assistance. So let's talk about security partnership. And then there is other areas, FATF, etc. But these issues have to be dealt with in the broader space of a positive U.S. Pakistan relationship, which is U.S. Pakistan, not Afghan lens and India lens and Timbuktu lens or whatever it is. Finally, let me just say there are two challenges as far as I'm concerned sitting in the office that I sit in. First of all, how do we engage? Yes, this administration is known to up-teen number of Pakistani officials and vice versa, but that's individualistic. What is the format in which we're going to have dialogue? What is the high-level interaction? Is it the old strategic dialogue? Is it another structured dialogue? Because I know this administration would prefer structure. Is it some other form of high-level dialogue? How do we get the real conversation going on these agenda items that I've laid out to you, which frankly are many which the US has always wanted to put on the table? Should we also look at track 2 to build the conversation? But I don't think there is any substitute for a structured high-level track 1 dialogue immediately. So I think that's a conversation we need to have now and figure out how do we get this conversation going. Second, I've laid out where Pakistan stands. We need to hear exactly the same from the US side on what their thinking is, where they think this could go. How can they assure us that they're not starting from where they left 4 years ago? And if Pakistan has changed, if Pakistan has changed the narrative, if Pakistan is talking about different things, then we also expect the US to move that marker and also tell us what the candid conversations will be and where the US will also have to come together and find ways to help Pakistan in different ways. What we don't want, Michael, is again a conversation on momentary, very important, but momentary issues where other lenses get applied again, and where Pakistan is seen as the scapegoat for things that may go wrong here or there. That conversation, I don't think people have too much patience for, because there are equal amount of good and bad memories on both sides. Last line, you give me 20 minutes, I think it's exactly on 20. The last line is, think about the fact that many naysayers who don't want this relationship to move forward have been talking about, oh, Pakistan is in some other camp. And many in this region will say, oh, US is already in the India camp. I'm not one of those. Pakistan is not one of those. We are not talking of one against the other. We want everybody to work together because that benefits Pakistan. It's a very clear self-interest for us. People who are dissing Pakistan and talking about the old things and have sort of built a lobby and a livelihood on bashing Pakistan in Washington. What does the US gain by losing Pakistan to another camp? And if the answer is nothing, then it is incumbent upon everybody to try and work this relationship in the direction that I've laid out. And there could be others, and the US would have its own views, but we are totally 100% open to improving this relationship, moving forward on a very new agenda, and we expect the same from the other side. And I'm sure that the new administration is already thinking along these lines, having worked with many of us in the past in different capacities, and recognizing the importance of Pakistan. Let me stop there. Thanks.
Well, thanks a lot, Moeed, for offering that very useful vision for how this relationship can and should look in a broader context. I think on many levels it makes a lot of sense. So we have a number of questions that have come in already, but I just wanted to pose a few to you first. And the first one is very simple. You had said that you looking forward to hearing from the U.S. about where it stands in this relationship. Can you tell us if your government has had any engagements yet with the Biden team and Biden himself? Has there been any outreach even at this early point?
Michael, as you know, we were told, and we fully respected the fact that this administration had decided not to engage foreign powers before inauguration. So, of course, formal outreach, the Prime Minister of Pakistan wrote a letter to the U.S. President, at the time President-elect. You know, there have been sort of public statements, but of course, the formal engagement, because this administration was not ready to do that with any country, we were told. So we respected that and waited for the inauguration to take place.
Okay, great. So just a few, I know that your theme is to talk about this relationship from a broader lens, not Afghanistan focused, but I think we could agree that at least in the immediate term, the Biden administration is going to continue to be looking at Afghanistan and Pakistan in that context as well. So first question in this regard is what can Pakistan do to help in the effort to get the Taliban to reduce its violence in Afghanistan? I think this will be a big concern for the new administration, as it was for the Trump administration. At a moment, you know what's happening in Afghanistan with the violence spiraling out of control. Is there a role for Pakistan to play here, particularly in working with Washington and Kabul to deal with this violence problem, given Pakistan's relationship with the Taliban?
Michael, I could spend a whole day explaining to you how many clock minutes Pakistani principals spend on this issue every day. And I'll be very candid with you. When I came into the system, of course, this is my first experience. I was one of those who was saying we're spending too much time on this. For a country who has so much to do otherwise, it's simply not affordable. So that's the amount of effort that has been put into Afghanistan. When this entire conversation was taking place for years, the goal was put the Afghans who matter in the room, get the US involved, and leave the room. That was the ask. That's exactly what Pakistan has done. So we are not in that room in that sense anymore. Whatever Pakistan can do to facilitate and push whichever side we are doing, we'll continue to do. But I want to be honest. It's easy to keep saying, do more, somebody should do this. It's the people sitting in the room who've got to make this decision. You and I, Pakistan, US, you, I, we could do whatever. It won't stick, it won't sustain unless there's meeting of the minds of the people sitting in the room. If violence has to be reduced, whatever the reasons are for that violence to continue, the other side has to address them. If the perpetrators of violence are known, have demands, that conversation has to happen there. Don't expect any outside power through any magic to bring peace or get to the finish line. It has to happen with the people in the room. That was the concept of Afghan-led, Afghan-owned. And so, I mean, that is the only way. Yes, helping hand, facilitating whatever Pakistan can do, we have been doing, we will keep doing, not because of the US. Let me be honest. It is because Pakistan benefits most from this. Now, there are certain things that the US has believed always Pakistan can do, which Pakistan cannot actually do. That conversation can keep happening, but if things that we can't do are put on our table, our only answer will be, it's just not possible for us to do that. So Pakistan in itself can't get a ceasefire. I mean, there's no magic wand here. There are dynamics, and you know this. I mean, we both have written a lot about this. I've written books on this or edited books on this. The dynamics of negotiations in these situations are always organic, driven by the parties in the room. External elements can help or harm, but it has to be in the room if you want to sustain whatever outcome there is.
Well, thank you. I think another of the Biden administration's top policy priorities in Afghanistan will be figuring out how to maintain a counter-terrorism capacity in Afghanistan, and especially if it has to do that without any troops left on the ground. So last July, as I recall, Mike Pompeo, of course, the Secretary of State at the time, he said in a TV interview that Pakistan, quote, will do the things that need to be done to reduce the footprint from Al-Qaeda. So to that end, my question is, what type of assistance might Pakistan be willing to provide to the U.S. in its efforts to maintain a CT capacity in Afghanistan? Might it be willing to share intelligence about Al-Qaeda's movements there, or to grant overflight rights to the U.S. to stage CT operations there, or even to agree to basing arrangements for U.S. troops, which have been made in the past? So what role might Pakistan be willing to play in this counterterrorism story in Afghanistan?
So one, I told you, we're open for economic basis. That's the conversation now, economic basis, okay? But to answer your question broadly, look, I mean, this is a US line, not my line, that there's no country that has done more to eliminate Al-Qaeda in cooperation with the US than Pakistan. I mean, there are numbers there, there are names there, so, nobody can sort of doubt this. CT presence, how much presence, how long presence, this is a decision Afghanistan has to make. Pakistan can't make this decision. The US perhaps can or not, but it's really for Afghanistan and the US to decide that. For us, the goal is very simple. We are available to facilitate peace in Afghanistan. And ultimately, we don't want any violence or terrorism in our region. But we can't be in a situation where Pakistan is seen as the potential solution for all problems, and when the solution doesn't come, then Pakistan is seen as the reason for all evils. That's the old conversation that we have to get away from if we want a real relationship that's a broader relationship where we really can benefit both sides. What we want to talk about is connectivity, a commercial relationship between Afghanistan, Pakistan, and co-investment. Whatever's required for that, we want the US to help, we want Pakistan to be part of that, we want Afghanistan to take the lead, and the rest of the world to keep investing and committing to Afghanistan.
Thank you. So getting to this issue of Pakistan playing a role as a partner in economic connectivity and so on, I think this makes very good sense for the U.S., for the administration to think of Pakistan as an economic partner or a greater economic partner, because, I mean, you know well, better than I, that there's already been a fair amount of robust trade. I think a few years ago, there was record high trade volume, I think in 2018. But certainly in Washington, there does remain a fair amount of skepticism about the investment climate in Pakistan, and perhaps a preference to trade more and invest more in countries that are treaty allies in the region and closer partners to the U.S. So what would be your bottom line elevator speech? If you were talking to a Biden administration official, what would be your pitch that it's worth Washington's while to really step up its economic partnership with Islamabad?
I could give you the DC elevator speech and the New York high-rise elevator speech, but I'll stick to the DC one in the interest of time. Very simple, Michael. US multinational companies who operate in Pakistan. You name the ones that are here, and not even US, I'd say just Western companies, Nestle, Procter & Gamble, telecom companies, GlaxoSmithKline, whatever, you name them, the big ones. I have data, from 2007 to 17, worst years in terms of terrorism, right? The profits that these companies were making in Pakistan were a factor of 2, 3, 4, 5 times their global average. That's all I need to tell an investor. You can tell me this is a problem, you can tell me ease of doing business and whatever. Of course, Pakistan is working on all of that. Like every developing country, there are issues. But what I'm telling you is proof is in the pudding. And that is that the companies, sister companies of those who we are hoping will invest in Pakistan, I'm talking of Western companies, so that the conversation doesn't go into, oh no, but these are global profits are not even 1/3 of profits they've made in Pakistan in the worst years of terrorism. And that's all I think an investor needs to hear.
Thank you. One geopolitical question, then I'll get to audience questions. The Biden administration, as you know, has signaled a desire to try to ease tensions with Iran to an extent, and perhaps to a lesser extent, China. But this certainly will not be easy, especially given developments during the last few weeks of the Trump administration. Do you think that Pakistan can play a role, that it can help the Biden administration ease tensions with some of these US rivals? Can Islamabad, which of course has good relations with both countries, especially China, be useful as an intermediary to help boost diplomacy between Washington and Tehran or Washington and Beijing?
You see, when I tell you that Pakistan is on an economic security paradigm, if there's conflict around, that paradigm is doomed to fail. So wherever we can help reduce tensions, where it's possible for us and where it doesn't hurt, it doesn't cross the line of our capacity, this is a conversation to be had. We may not be able to, we may think that it's not for us to do, but these are exactly the conversations we want to start with, rather than, again, the old sort of prism where both sides will again, have a difficult time. So you've laid it out. Yes, let's have this conversation, and definitely we can find overlaps where it benefits both sides.
Okay, thanks. We've got a large number of questions from the audience, so I may try to group some together here. There are a range of questions. The first one I'll pose to you is, what is the likelihood that Pakistan will develop relations with Israel? And if it won't, why not?
Answer is none. And the reason is that Pakistan has a very clear principled stance on Palestine, which is identical to its stance on Kashmir. Obey international law, give people the rights that international law has given them. And in Palestine's case, it's a respectable two-state solution. Move away from that, Pakistan will not be on board. A lot of people have told me personally, oh, you'll benefit this way or that way. That's the difference between a short-term mercantile mindset and a principled stance. So we have a very clear stance, and the Prime Minister of Pakistan has made it absolutely clear on where we stand on that.
Well, thank you. Next question is, in the context of economic and energy security, will Pakistan push for or seek exemption for the Iran-Pakistan gas pipeline from any actual or potential US sanctions?
Don't know the answer to that. Don't know the answer to that because we don't know where the Biden administration is going. So, ultimately the sanctions, the US is the champion of those sanctions. So we'll have to see what policy Washington adopts before we know where we can go with.
Okay, question that goes back to Afghanistan. How do you think Islamabad is changing its relations with the US after the Afghan peace process? I think that gets to an interesting question about, well, you could answer that anyway. It's sort of a broad question. What leverage does Pakistan lose, and what does it have to offer to the US for this relationship?
Let me just say this. A lot of, this has been a conversation, as you know, in think tank circles or whatever. Even if Pakistan loses all leverage over the US, we want peace in Afghanistan. That's how much it helps us. So this is not even a conversation. How much leverage will be left or not left. If there is peace in Afghanistan, to sustain the peace in Afghanistan, there has to be a stable economy. Is there any way there can be a stable economy that can be sustained without Pakistan's transit? Is there any way it can happen without Pakistan, Afghanistan trading more than they've ever done before? Is there any way for Pakistan to gain access to Central Asia and for Central Asia to export through Gwadar port unless Afghanistan is peaceful? So, for us, everything else pales in comparison when it comes to our western border.
Okay, thank you. There's a question about climate change. You mentioned that climate change is a serious issue for Pakistan. Does Pakistan have a concrete plan for addressing its water crisis, and what can the US do to help the country, Pakistan, while assuring that the aid is not misused?
You should answer this question. You wrote the book. Look, water security is one of our biggest challenges. When you introduced me, you mentioned national security and strategic policy planning. I fought for that part of my title or portfolio because that's where Pakistan needs to invest a lot of time and effort. right? Water security, climate. Pakistan is the fifth most vulnerable country, and we, in the grand scheme of things, we are not a major polluter at all. And so the point here is, yes, it's a huge challenge. We are cognizant. Water management, again, I don't know the exact plan and strategy because it's not, my portfolio. Colleagues of mine in the cabinet who are working on this but I know that this is one of the top priorities of the Prime Minister. Now, I also won't be able to recall what specifically, but as we are planning our engagement with the Biden administration, I just this morning I was sort of working on something, and one of the points of cooperation we have identified very specifically is on water management and technology. Again, don't ask me what it was specifically. It's been laid out by the people who are looking after this. So yes, it's an agenda item that definitely should be discussed because it's a need that Pakistan has. And frankly, if Pakistan has water security with the kind of arable land we have, Pakistan is able to provide food security not only to Pakistan, but much of the Middle East and many, many other countries who are food deficient in the region.
Well, thank you. Staying on this theme of natural resource issues, another question is that you had mentioned partnerships with the U.S. on energy investment. How do you think China would respond to such a partnership that challenges their position in the sector? This may get to your earlier comments about Pakistan not wanting to be in a camp policy, but if you want to respond to that.
Why does it challenge? I think, again, allow me to say this. I'm far away now. I have to confess, I don't follow Washington as closely just because of time issues. But I really think there is a very the conversation on China has gotten too big too fast, and there's now a set narrative, and I think it's not good for anybody. Why would China ever come and say that? I mean, every country has the right to seek investment, and China has made a lot of beneficial investment in Pakistan. I'm not going to shy away from that. It's a major strategic and economic partner. It's put in liquidity into Pakistan's economy and market. All of that is true. That does not mean that a competitive American company who comes in and invests in energy, big time or small scale, is competing for a geostrategic sort of narrative. I mean, I think ultimately, Pakistan, just like the US, works through private sector in the commercial space. You have a good project, you come in, you invest, you're welcome. There are GE turbines that are running CPEC energy plants as we speak. It's happening. There are German technology in those plants. So look at this purely commercially, and whoever can invest, absolutely, why not?
Well, thank you. Let's see. I was going to ask you a question about, pardon me, bear with me. Let's see. A question about trade relations between the U.S. and Pakistan. There's been talk of the Pakistan single window, and the question is, if this PSW legislation has passed, what steps are in place to implement it? Could there be additional legislation, and would it be a game changer for Pakistan's economy? Would this improve trade relations between the U.S. and Pakistan?
So the one window is, of course, not US specific in that sense, right? I mean, basically, it's all part of ease of doing business. If you want investment in a country, you create incentives and ease off any of the regulations. That's the idea. Done right, it will be a game changer. Definitely will be a game changer, because what does the investor want? They want to come to one place, get their 15 licenses, get whatever they, taxation, this and that managed in any country. And the data is unequivocal. Countries who've done this well are up on the ease of doing business, get more investment. So yes, it is going to be a game changer. Legislation has passed or not, I'm afraid I don't exactly know. I know it was in process. I'm not entirely sure what point it's at. I tend to think it may have, because there's active work going on in terms of creating this. But again, don't hold me to this.
Okay, thanks. A few questions now about social issues, about democracy and human rights. One question is that democracy building is high up in Biden's agenda, We know Pakistan has a lot to do before being considered a meaningful democracy rather than an electoral one. Do you think Prime Minister Khan would be ready to make necessary changes in his own policy related to freedom of expression, access to justice, rights of smaller provinces, such as by protecting the 18th Amendment, and by ensuring civilian supremacy in democratic policymaking? As you know, these are questions that continue to be asked in Washington, even though you may not like that.
I think all of us in today's world have to answer these questions. You know, even the beacons of democracy are struggling badly with this. Many countries in the world. So let me say this, Michael. First of all, I think it's a slightly unfair question because conversations about access to justice, conversations about poverty alleviation, which is a fundamental sort of human right issue for developing countries, you know, conversations about getting the poor to become less vulnerable and gradually part of the lower middle and then middle class. There is no other person who has ruled this country who is so genuinely empathetic and working towards that. I mean, I have no, you know, personal relationship with my boss. I mean, you know, I'm saying this purely professionally, but the individual and the personality, you know, Asas cash transfer program, for those of you who haven't followed, for the first time, Pakistan is moving towards universal healthcare coverage. I mean, this is groundbreaking. This is paradigm shifting. So on that, I think if anybody is not convinced, I mean, that's very unfair. As far as the other issues are concerned, as I told you, the conversation that needs to happen is for me to show you, here is where we were, here is where we are, here is where we want to go. Of course, there are challenges. There are going to be challenges. The entire world is struggling with managing relationships with media and social media and the expression space. This is not Pakistan. I mean, the entire world is trying to figure out how to deal with the post ICT world, right? I mean, every country, US included. And we've got to find the right equilibrium and the right balance. On the name of freedom of expression, we cannot have religious, social, cultural sensitivities trampled and just declared freedom of expression. On the other hand, absolutely, the right to express has to be there. And that equilibrium, every country in their cultural context is struggling. Pakistan's actually made a lot of progress. There's still areas we're working on, we need to work on. All of that process will continue. The commitment is 100% there. There should be no doubt about. Your last part, civil military. Look, let me say this. This is, again, an old talking point. You and I have talked about this, I think, a million times, and all of us. The conversation in Pakistan is more democratic than most countries, I would argue, in the developing world. Pakistan is not a country where you can't have this conversation about civil military. Tell me one other country that you know of where the narrative in Washington is, oh, the military is dominant and supreme, right? That's the narrative. Has anybody followed the public conversation about civil military in this country in the past year? I could go further back, but in the past year, tell me one other country where you can so openly criticize anybody, everybody, individual. I'm not for it, by the way. I think many lines have been crossed. It's not healthy for Pakistan's social fabric and democracy. But what I'm telling you is this argument that, oh, this conversation is stifled. Oh, nobody can challenge an institution. I mean, the record is just public. Just look at the kind of conversation that's happened. In fact, as I said, it's crossed many, many cultural, legal, and political lines. So that's one. Second, the conversation, the kind of conversation you want to have about civil military, let me just say this. Pakistan is following to the T a democratic model, but what you are looking for in terms of my answer, you're not going to get. If the Pakistani Prime Minister says publicly that he wants to use X arm of his state to help wherever there is incapacity, then that's his right under the Constitution. If somebody is bothered by too many meetings between the Pakistani army chief and prime minister and intelligence chief, so be it. That's what Pakistan, the prime minister, wants in terms of running an efficient ship at this point. It does nothing to undermine democracy, nothing to bring anything into question. That's the most effective model we have right now. We have all hands on deck, and we've essentially got a totally convergent civil military conversation in Pakistan. I understand many don't like it for their own reasons, but I don't think as a Pakistani policymaker, that's not my concern. My concern is to make sure all rules are followed and laws are followed, and within that, I want to find the most effective model for me to move forward. And let me just end on that. 5 years from now, I hope that I don't need a national command and operations center where I have to pull in a lot of my non-civilian entities to help in the COVID response. I hope that I'm at a point where all of this is done by the civilians. At this point, we're not there. We need that arm of the state. We've used that to great effect, and you've seen the results. Just because somebody's upset that why did you actually do that? Well, I'm sorry, that's not how policy is made.
Thank you. Though I will say that there do remain concerns here about what has happened to some critics, such as those with the PTM and some journalists and so on. I think those concerns will remain. At any rate, a question about, it's actually several questions about human rights in China, which I know is a tricky matter, but I'll pose I'll group the questions together. The Biden administration is likely to be quite strong in its criticism of China's oppression of its Uyghur Muslim community, which the Trump administration in its final days described as genocide, and the presumptive Biden administration Secretary of State Anthony Blinken said he agrees with that designation. So you had indicated in an interview a few months back that this issue is a non-issue. So did you want to offer any comments on that, clarify that, or how you believe Pakistan should deal with this very sensitive issue?
So first of all, Michael, let me say this. If the agenda is human rights, then conversations have to happen not only on what suits geostrategic interests. I want to remind everybody that there is a territory called Jammu and Kashmir, one of the longest standing UN disputes, illegally occupied by India. We've seen what has happened there in the last 2 years. Don't believe me. Look at Amnesty, look at International Crisis Group, look at your own congressmen and women, look at the British parliamentarians. Where is the world? I haven't asked anybody to come and give me the territory tomorrow. What have I asked? I've asked normalization, human rights, and follow international law and what it says the resolution, or how it says the resolution should come. Is that too much to ask for anybody in the world who's championing the cause of human rights? So I want to lay this on the table so that there's no hypocrisy here. That's the first thing. And we, at least sitting in Pakistan, see, and I'm not talking about the US at all, just globally, that short-term mercantilist interests are driving a policy that is driving a nuclear region to the brink of a conflict or whatever it is. Your question about what I said in the interview. So let me just repeat what I said, because it was twisted and tamed in ways that was interesting. Look, first of all, any conversation that the US has with another country is none of Pakistan's business. Even India, Pakistan is not saying zero sum. Pakistan is saying have your relationship, do whatever, as long as it's not directed at Pakistan. And if things happen which clearly can then undermine Pakistan's security, of course we're going to be worried. So now the China part. Look, let me say what I had said, and I hope you translate it correctly. What I had said was, Pakistan and China have a special relationship. In that special relationship, there is total transparency. And every single conversation we want to have, even if there were an issue, we have. The Chinese know everything they need to know about us, and we know everything we need to know about China. What is the model and modus operandi of this relationship? It is that we have all conversations in confidence so that we can resolve issues, not for grandstanding, not for public. Okay? What did I say? It's a non-issue for us. And I repeat, it's a non-issue for us because we have channels to discuss everything. So when people come and say, oh, you didn't say anything, I don't need to say anything to anybody about Lahore, Islamabad, Beijing, Shanghai, this or that, because I hope one day the US and Pakistan have that relationship, right? Which is candid enough. Why do I have to go on TV every day in Pakistan and talk about India and what India is doing, right? If you read my writings from the past, I had a very different view, and you know this. So why am I doing this as a Pakistani official? Because there is no recourse in which a real, sober, adult conversation can happen directly, where decisions can be made on the basis of fairness, respect, and international law. So I must tell the world what this country is doing. In this case, it's simply not an issue for me, right? And so the gossip that some may want from Pakistan on this is not going to come. Next, let me be clear that if we have an issue with something, and I'm not pointing now to China or US or whatever, every country has a mechanism to deal with things. I may have a problem, let's assume I may have an issue on a project on CPEC. I'll deal with it the same way directly because I have full confidence China will do the same thing. So even if I were to grant you that, oh, this is a conversation that must happen, I'm not saying to you that it's a conversation I need to have. I'm saying for me, it's a non-issue to approach China on anything. China respects that. I respect China. I am in the picture completely, and China is in the picture completely. That is what I had said that day. It was completely taken to a different plane and blah, blah. But anyways.
Well, thank you for spelling that out and clarifying that. We have just a few minutes, and I know we need to wrap up right at 10, but two quick questions which I'll pose together, and if you could respond to them briefly, that would be great, then we'll wrap up. But the first one is, how do you think the US should approach CPEC? And secondly, US companies have expressed major concerns about recent digital regulations. Why is Pakistan prioritizing business climate? Why isn't Pakistan prioritizing business climate considerations in its digital economy framework?
Sorry, I lost your first question. Sorry, CPEC US, yeah. So great question. And the answer is, look at it as a major opportunity. Why? One, you are dealing with the 5th largest market in the world. Okay, call it Pakistan, call it ABC, but there are 220 million people. It's a misnomer to say that Pakistan's per capita income is low, so the consumer market is not as lucrative. The urban per capita income purchasing power of Pakistan is second to none in terms of our compatriots in the developing world. Second, an investor wants to come into Pakistan and invest. What does the investor need? Needs electricity, needs gas, needs roads, needs connection, needs connectivity to the port, etc. Right? This is what an investor wants. What has CPEC done? It has provided all of these to Pakistan in a way that it didn't have before. So if there's an economic interest, if there's a reprocessing interest, if there's an investment interest, the ground reality infrastructure for an investor, whether from the US or Brazil or whatever, is far better than it was 5-7 years ago. Look at CPEC from this angle. Look at CPEC as giving connectivity which can be much more easily extended to Afghanistan now. And let's find how to sustain Afghanistan's economy through co-investment in projects in Afghanistan, building on this connectivity. That's what I would the US would look at to benefit.
Moeed, unfortunately, with our connection is gone off. We can't hear. I think we've lost you, Moeed. And I think, unfortunately, if we don't get you back in the next second, I probably will just go ahead and wrap up. because we are out of time. Okay, well, it looks like Moeed is there, but he's cutting out.
Pakistanis, many million Afghans, and hello.
Yeah, I'm sorry you cut out for a moment, Moeed, but we're going to have to wrap up. Can you hear me? I think it looks like we've lost him. Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap up because it is 10 o'clock. I was hoping that he could have been here to hear me thank him for his contribution. That was a great discussion. I thank Moeed for his being willing to take an hour with us to lay out his vision of U.S.-Pakistan relations in the Biden era. And I appreciate his willingness to answer a wide variety of questions as well. And I wanted to thank all of you for listening to us. Apologies that we lost Moeed at the end, but I guess it's better that we lost him for the last minute than during the first minute. So thank you all for listening. We will have this, this event posted on the Wilson Center website soon, in case you want to see it or spread the word. But thank you very much for joining us, and stay safe and stay well. Take care. We are adjourned.